Welcome back to Base Christian History tonight. I have a really special video tonight because tonight we're not going to be doing the Galatians chapter 4 live stream, which is what I originally had planned to do tonight. Rather, what we're going to be looking at is an interview which I recorded for this channel, which is really exciting because getting the opportunity to talk with these brothers was really cool. We're going to look at a book called Origin, Why Genesis 1 to 11 trumps secular accounts. Now this book, Origin, Why Genesis 11 Trumps Secular Accounts, is a book I highly recommend. I finished reading it early this year. And what I love about this book is it takes many of the different arguments for the Christian creationist perspective and condenses them down into one readily accessible book. You can buy lots of different books which cover a lot of the stuff in this book, but this book has summarized these arguments down into one book for you, which is an incredible resource for pastors who like to preach on these issues. It's an incredible resource for Bible college lecturers, incredible resource for just your general Christians who want to learn more about these issues. But even if you're a non-Christian, I would highly recommend that you check this book out because it will show you that there is a credibility to the Christian worldview, and it'll show you that the Genesis 1 to 11 account has a very strong scientific evidence base to back it up. You know, we talk about faith, trusting in that which we cannot necessarily see, right? But that does not mean that Christians do not have evidence to back up their faith, and this book does a really good job of showing you that. Just before we get into the video, let me remind you to pick up my book, Like a Roaring Lion, which you can pick up on Amazon, or lockpress.com, Like a Roaring Lion, How the Evil One Seeks to Destroy You. You can read my writings on younggospelminister.blogspot.com and also on Revs Matt's writings on Substack. But tonight we're going to look at the book written by Graham and Jeffrey Messer called Origin. I hope you enjoy this interview because this is a really good book. God bless you, and I'll catch you later. Welcome back to Base Christian History. I've got a very special episode for you guys today because today we're actually going to be talking about this book written by Graham and Jeffrey Messer called Origin, Why Genesis 1 to 11 Trumps Secular Accounts. Now, I'm really excited to talk about this book. I've read this book. I finished it in late January, early February, and it's really important to understand where we come from and also which worldview matches with the reality of the world in which we live in better. And this book is one of the best books that I have read which does that. And if you are interested in this topic, or even if you are well versed in this topic, I can guarantee you are going to learn stuff from this book, which we're going to talk about in this interview today. So please buckle up and get ready for a fun interview where we talk about many of the different issues in this book, but also things which impact modern science, modern philosophy, history, worldviews, but also just who are we and what are we supposed to be in this life? There are different competing answers for that question, and I think the Bible gives us the best answer, and any book which can help defend that biblical worldview is worth looking at. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. So we have Graham and Jeffrey Messer. Would you guys be just able to tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So we're both professionals. We're both university graduates. I studied engineering. Jeffrey studied anesthetics. We were brought up in a Christian home, though, where Genesis 1 to 11 was taught as history, and that you know, a straightforward interpretation was favoured. So, you know, we grew up believing in Genesis, what you might call the young Earth creationist viewpoint. So I'll just hand over to Jeff.
Yeah, so my interest in this topic, so as Graham said, we were brought up with that viewpoint from a young age, but probably 10 or 15 years ago I came across, got quite interested in some American Reconstructionist Christian writers, and I was interested that they considered the Genesis 1 to 11 interpretation, young Earth interpretation, as important, if not foundational. And the authors I was reading had written a fair bit around the topic, and that introduced me to the importance of the topic and also got me across some of the historical and philosophical aspects. And so that sparked my interest.
Awesome. So, Graham, you're an engineer?
Yep.
And Jeffrey, you're a doctor?
Yes.
So what are your specialties in your particular fields?
Well, I studied mechanical engineering, but to be honest, I've had a fairly varied career. I've worked in education, and I've since then I've worked in public administration. So a varied career, but I do have a scientific sort of bent, if you like. So, I find this topic fascinating.
Awesome.
Yeah, so Matt, so I studied medicine, did back in my day, it was 6 years of training for the course, and then went on and specialised in anaesthesia. And I've always had an interest in science, in maths, in philosophy, and so I've read around those topics in my own time, and I think that sort of helped prepare me for this book, the research that we were going to have to do to produce the book.
Yeah, and it's obvious that some real serious research was gone into this. I mean, I've read the book. You guys did a phenomenal work of compiling a large amount of information, but condensing it down into one resource, which is one of the reasons why I recommend this book. I could probably recommend to you to the audience out there, I could probably recommend to you 10 different creationist books, which would cover some of the topics that are in this book. But this book covers basically all the topics of those 10 books, and it's only in one book, which I think is one of the reasons why this book is so important and also so useful.
Yeah, well, that's what we intended this as a like a high level overview. So when you think overview, it's nonetheless it is over 400 pages, but it covers off on just about every topic you need to know to get a grip over the whole debate.
Yeah, and I think you've done that very well. All right, so let's get into the book. I've got a few topics that I want to ask about. You guys have suggested some topics, so let's go through some of the stuff which you've mentioned first. So let's talk about abiogenesis. So you guys have made the point in your book that abiogenesis, or is it abiogenesis, however we pronounce it,
Sure.
is a weak point in the secular narrative. So can you explain what that term means and why it is a weak point?
Yeah. So yeah, it is a clumsy word, but most people would recognise, the parts of the word. So bio meaning life in there. There's genesis meaning the beginning, and the part at the beginning, the a, that might be found in words like atypical. It means not. So put them all together, and you get life that's arisen from non-living matter. So. But just to go back a step, is why has this concept of abiogenesis come forth? So originally, if we go back in time to around when Darwin was on the voyage of the Beagle, so about the 1830s, the prevailing view was that life started from what was called spontaneous generation. So that was a process where people had observed that if you had like a standing pond, you see water creatures appearing in there, or if you had, for example, if you put out some meat and just left it there, maggots might appear on it. So it looked like things were spontaneously appearing. But what happened was, as time went on, through to about 1859, 1860, Louis Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation. He showed that life doesn't just originate, just doesn't come from nothing. And he had this phrase, life comes from life. So at that point, Thomas Henry Huxley, who is sort of known as Darwin's bulldog and obviously a great advocate for Darwinism in the early days, he came up with this term abiogenesis. And what he was getting at there was, unlike spontaneous generation where life might continually come into being, this was seen as a highly unlikely event that might only have happened once in the history of the earth, as little as once. And a process whereby a sort of a self-replicating organism came into being. So that sort of gives you an introduction as to what abiogenesis is. I might just hand to Jeff to talk about why it's considered unlikely.
Yeah, so from a Christian point of view, obviously the Bible actually teaches that abiogenesis, in a certain sense, did happen. Adam was formed from dust. God breathed into him life. So that was a supernatural form of abiogenesis. But what Huxley was talking about was a purely naturalistic form, where molecules came together and formed a living organism. Now, this problem has been researched intensively for many decades now, and there's no consensus position on how this might have occurred. There's a number of different theories. One of the well-known ones is the RNA world hypothesis. But even today, experts in the field will admit that it's one of the most difficult conundrums in modern biology to explain how life could organise itself in a non-directed way, naturalistic way. And you'll even find some notable experts such as George Wald back in the 1950s or 60s describing it as a miracle, because it's just very difficult to see how it might have happened. So whereas obviously from a naturalistic point of view, if you hold to the idea that the world is material, then abiogenesis is a necessity to your worldview. It must be that life generated spontaneously at some point, even if it was an extremely rare or even one-off event. So whereas from a Christian point of view, we're sort of thinking, what's the best explanation? What's the most probable thing? We know abiogenesis. There's no explanation after decades of research as to how it could happen. It seems highly improbable if you look at calculations for the sorts of things that would have to happen. And so from our point of view, we're saying this looks like it's virtually scientifically implausible. Whereas I think from a different worldview, you're going to, from the materialist worldview, you accept it as a presupposition because it's part and parcel of your worldview. It doesn't matter how improbable it looks. What you'll tend to think is it's happened because we're here. We just haven't found the explanation yet.
It's what the physicists would call, or quantum mechanics might call, a singularity. Something which has only happened once, which is very difficult to explain. Like the beginning of the universe, which is one of the reasons why they've suggested things like multiverse theory and stuff like this, because if there's an infinite number of universes, it stands to reason there's one in which life could exist. Now that sounds logical, but it's not necessarily true, because our biogenesis, as you've said, is coined to try and explain basically how life came about. It's a very difficult event, but the law of biogenesis, which is a law of science, the law of biogenesis says life begets life. So in a sense, what you see in Genesis is God takes the material, the dirt of the ground, from which, in fact, Adamah means dirt. Many Christians will know that. And he breathes life. So that's life begetting life. It is an example of biogenesis. What I find fascinating about this topic is that naturalistic science really drills down into, you need to use the scientific method to determine truth. And according to every single scientific experiment that has been done, life is necessary to beget life. Now, that scientists, as some might say, leave the possibility that maybe they haven't done the experiments right. But if the basis of your worldview is the scientific method, and the scientific method says that the foundation of your worldview is flawed, doesn't that show a massive weakness in the secular worldview? I mean, it's got an inherent contradiction there, don't you think?
I think this comes down to worldviews. So I think from the perspective of Christianity, we look at it and feel they're clutching at straws. This is extremely unlikely and not scientifically plausible, at least. But it's difficult to convince someone, I think, when their worldview relies on something having happened. That's their entire worldview. It's hard to get someone to change their worldview, oftentimes with evidence, because they'll interpret that evidence that you supply through their own worldview. And so, from our point of view, it looks like a very weak, a huge weakness in the secular origins account. But I think it's still not necessarily easy to convince someone who is committed to that worldview.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is fair. I mean, we can talk about how the gospel says that the power of the gospel is necessary to break down those strongholds in people, you know, that lack of unbelief. You need the Holy Spirit at work. You need the message proclaimed really clearly. I'm a preacher. That's what I do. I preach the word, get into the word, and we got to preach it unapologetically. But you are right. There is a stubbornness in the sinful human to want to cling on to ideas that are the foundation of even bad ideas. Because if you give that up, it brings into question a whole bunch about your own identity. So it's very hard to do that. But I think what you can say is that science has no answer to origin. And they say, well, we will work it out. We will work it out. What is that? That's a statement of faith. They believe that they will work it out. Now, some people might be listening to me saying this and say, haha, Matt, you've just fallen into the God of the Gaps theory. Just because science cannot explain something does not mean there is not an explanation. No, that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is science has actually the weight of scientific evidence. If you take the materialistic worldview at its claims, the weight of their own evidence points to the foundation of their worldview being wrong and the foundation of our worldview being right. So many people say, well, Christians, you guys believe in stuff without evidence. Well, actually, we've got a lot of evidence. Life comes from life. What does the Bible teach? Life came from life. In fact, our worldview, and that's one of the reasons for this book, that the Messrs are doing in this book, is they're showing that the Christian worldview fits really well with the scientific evidence. It is not an anti-scientific faith. Many people out there, you might be watching this right now, you might have come across this on YouTube by accident and thought, oh, watch this, and you see 3 Christians sitting here thinking, come on guys, you guys just believe in stuff in faith. And yes, we do have faith. We do have faith. But there is a lot of evidence that faith is rational and real and something solid to trust in. And the fact that science actually fits with that worldview, that life comes from life, just because the scientific mainstream doesn't accept that does not mean that the evidence doesn't point in that direction, which I think is really compelling. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, look, I agree with what you're saying. The preponderance of scientific evidence right now is consistent with the Christian position, and I think it's a glaring weakness in the naturalistic explanation. Yeah,
and I think it's a really vital point. All right, cool.
Yeah, I think, but what Jeff was saying, it comes back to worldview. So if and just to talk about that, just to bring that up so that people are sort of aware of it. So in origin science, this worldview matters. So it's like the assumptions that you start with going into as you go into to begin your investigations. But we can distinguish that from sort of empirical science, the science of experiments. Because whether you're a Christian or an atheist, doing sort of repeatable experiments is really of no great consequence. So for example, if you think of the kind of experiments you might do in a high school chemistry class, so long as you've got quality apparatus, that you've got well calibrated ability to measure, to do the measurements, and you conduct the experiment well, then anyone ought to be able to do that experiment and repeat it later and get the same results. But when we go to origins, it's more like the forensics. So we're not dealing with repeatable experiments. We're dealing with one-off past events and trying to come up with a narrative about why they turned out the way they did. So and when obviously when we talk about forensics, political biases can come into this. And so I was thinking recently of, one well-known example would be the Warren Commission that investigated JFK's assassination. A lot of Americans looked at that and thought, well, we're not sure that that's right. Even though there were ballistic experts showing it, the directions that bullets must have taken, a lot of people weren't convinced. And suffice it to say that there was enough contention in that for a Hollywood movie to be made out of it. So biases come into play in origin science. So I think that's a key takeaway.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make, because your worldview will determine how you handle the facts in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with the same soil, we're dealing with the same bones in the ground, we're dealing with the same rock layers, we're dealing with the same natural environment, we're dealing with the same equipment, as you mentioned. all of that across, whether it's creationists through to evolutionists, or you've got theistic evolutionists, they're all using the same kind of data, the same kind of measurements, all of that. But the kind of approach you take to an investigative process, you see this all the time, actually. You can kind of see this, how they do this. In fact, last night, my wife and I, we watched Midsummer Murders. Midsummer Murders, great show. A classic British investigative show. And I grew up watching these shows with my mum. I grew up watching, you know, I used to love Diagnosis Murder and all that sort of stuff. Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah.
So if you watch enough of these, you start to get how they're going to tell the story, and you can kind of direct. But this one still tricked us. Couldn't really work out who the killer was till the end. But what they did in this show is they built up the narrative that one guy clearly looked guilty. All the evidence pointed to him. His watch was at the scene. You know, his time wasn't accounted for. He didn't have an alibi. You know, he even had lipstick from the woman in his bedroom on his shirt. Like all the evidence pointed to this one guy, and you're like, well, you know, why aren't they arresting this guy? Because it's clear that but you, as you're watching the show, you realize that what's happening is he's being framed. Now, if you're a police officer and you're just wanting to get the case done really quickly, you've got all the evidence you need. He's got no alibi. He's got a motive. It's all pointing towards him. You could hone in on that, and sometimes they'll do that in shows. The police officer gets it wrong and arrests an innocent man, and that's the story. But in this show, what they were showing is all the misdirection, and there were actually more killers than people realized. And the person who turned out at the end, you didn't actually get it until the very end of the story. They did a very good job. But this show highlighted exactly what you're talking about. Forensics is not the same as truth. Forensics exists, and it has truth in it. For example, that is the lipstick of that woman, but that doesn't mean that he put it there or he killed her. How you interpret that evidence is vital and really important. So you actually let's build on this. You guys talk about this in your book with the case of MH370. Now, I found that fascinating because we still have no idea what happened to that plane. Yeah. And so do you guys want to give a little bit of insight into how that's relevant to the origins debate and what you guys mentioned there?
Yeah, so with MH370, you'll recall that that aeroplane, Malaysian's airline aircraft, went missing, and there's been a substantial investigation, sea searches and so forth, and a fair bit of evidence has been able to be brought to bear on the case in terms of radio signals and whatnot to try and locate where this plane might have gone missing as the start of an explanation for why it went missing. And there was an Australian journalist, Ian Higgins, the late Ian Higgins, who wrote a book about this, and he brought up the point that different experts have come up with different explanations for what might have happened, because and all of them are potentially plausible. He had a favoured theory himself, but as he pointed out, he can't be certain about it. You can't. It's compatible with the evidence, but it's not proven by the evidence. And I think this is the same concept that maps to origins narratives. Different origins narratives can be compatible with the evidence, and it's difficult just from evidence to prove one correct and one wrong. Yeah. And so I think what tends to happen in origins is, one group might try and paint the other group as unscientific or naive, whereas if you actually look at the work that the specialist ministries are working on, you'll find there's a lot of intellectual rigour and excellent scholarship. So I think, it's the same in the MH370. The officials had to come up with a proposed hypothesis so that they could proceed with the search according to parameters. But no one is certain that is in fact correct. Did you have anything further to add, Graham?
Well, just while you're thinking about that, I just want to mention, so in the book you mentioned how there was a political position which actually cancelled out a whole realm of investigation. Like a particular area of the ocean was just shut off because like we're not even going to accept that explanation as a possibility. And if I remember correctly, I think one of them was that it was a jihad, or like he was an extremist. I think another one was that he was suicidal. And my favorite theory to read about was that he eloped and changed his identity. And like that might sound like, well, hang on, it doesn't. But that's actually a recorded thing that's happened with pilots on occasion in the past. It has actually happened before. So the evidence was consistent with multiple different theories. And it's fascinating to read about this because, firstly, it's fascinating because I remember when that happened, and I remember there was someone at one of my churches that I was at who knew some people. It was either on that flight or one of the other flights that went down at a similar time. So these flights affected real life people. This was a real life tragedy. It affected real living people, connected to people in our country. But also, this is like a modern mystery, which is just fascinating to look into. But secondly, it directly gets into the origins debate because, as you guys are talking about, it's not like creationists are ignoring the evidence. They're trying to put the evidence together in a systematic way, just as secular scientists are. But we have different boundaries in our worldview which tell us which way to look. But this is what's important, and this is why this MH370 part, why I really recommend reading this, is because what it shows is you can actually cross off, foolishly, credible avenues of investigation if you don't have the correct worldview. And it will lead you down a dead path. And I don't know if you mentioned this in the book, but I can't remember because I've actually read a few more books since this one as well.
Yeah.
But I do know that science really started to blossom a little bit in the Islamic civilization. It sort of like started to take, and it just died off. And part of that was because of Islamic presuppositions about how the world works. Like Christianity believes in an orderly, stable existence. Islam doesn't necessarily teach that, but we see the same thing in ancient Greece. We see it a little bit maybe in ancient Egypt, a little bit in Mesopotamia. I mean, the Romans were an incredibly advanced civilization. They built concrete, used concrete in their walls with their bricks that is more advanced than anything we can make today. I think they've learnt how to finally replicate it, but it's really expensive. But it's a self-replicating form of concrete that when water gets in there, it crystallizes, it creates a chemical reaction which crystallizes, which is one of the reasons why Roman walls in so many areas are still standing, why some of their roads are still in use, although they have been repaired over time. But I bring this up, they were incredibly advanced. You know, they were able to build siege warfare to take down big cities, but they never developed science. So the development of science is really something which is unique to Western civilization. And it's because of these particular ideas. And the point is, if you have a worldview which shuts off areas of investigation, that limits your ability to actually do science, which is what you're basically pointing out in that chapter with MH370.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So I think in these various places, and different groups of people, including the Muslims and the Chinese and various groups over history, they have had exceptional thinkers who did bring up scientific ideas, some of which we've inherited in the West. But I think the difference is that all of these starts that looked really promising, they just petered out. It started, there was flashes of utter brilliance in the Muslim world, in China, the ancient Greeks and so forth, but there was no sustainable scientific enterprise. So I think what Christianity managed to do, which the other historical periods, in the 15 and 1600s and on, they managed to get this sustainable scientific enterprise going, which is what we're enjoying today, is the fruits of that progress. It's continued on, but it only started in once in history, and it started, the sustainable scientific enterprise started in Christian Europe.
Yeah, it's actually phenomenal. I've done a fair bit of reading into this topic. Rodney Stark is a good author who talks about some of the origins of science.
Yeah.
Tom Holland, I haven't read his specific work on this, but I know he writes about that. I've read some of his other histories. He's a phenomenal historian. What I find fascinating about science, and many people like to argue, oh, science, we're talking worldviews, right? They're like, science is completely antithetical to the Christian worldview, but that is not correct. In fact, many people might not be aware of this, but science is actually directly from theology, and not just from theology, but from the practice of theology. And I've written about this in my own writings, and it's really important to understand how one of the reasons why it took off in Western society the way it did is because in the theological schools of the universities, which were started in Europe by these monks, they were basically monasteries. They started to study the Word of God. They did something which many ancient societies had not done before. In sort of ancient Greece, ancient China, even in the ancient Islamic world, they would take the works of the greats. They would copy them, they would treasure them, and one of the reasons why we still have them today is because they did this. So we should be thankful for that work. But they would kind of take them and say, well, you've got to memorize these, learn these. These are the ideas of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, all these guys, and we're just going to pass this on. Whereas what the church did, what these monks did, is they recognized, because of the biblical worldview, the fallen nature of man, which leads to the imperfection of knowledge, which means that as great as these guys were, there were imperfections. So what they started to do is they started to not just copy them, but to critique them and improve on them. And in these schools, in these monasteries, what they would do is they would present a theory, say, on the nature of God, which included a bit of Aristotle, a bit of Augustine, plus also the scripture. They would bring it to their peers, they would review it as peers, debate it, and then improve on the theory. Now that is actually the beginning of the process of what we call peer-reviewed science. In other words, when I say, and I'm saying this to you guys out there, when I say that science comes out of theology, I don't mean in a general sense. I mean specifically, the actual process of the development of Western theology is what led to the creation of the modern scientific method. And that is the key difference. And so it's really important to understand. And one of the reasons why this book is so vital to read is it shows you that the legacy of that scientific method, which has been passed down in that scientific pursuit, is consistent with Christianity for a good reason, because the Christian worldview deals in truth, and science is the pursuit of truth. So let's keep going with some of these topics that you guys have here. I want to talk about this. We can kind of lead on from what we've been talking about. Now, I consider myself reasonably well read in ancient Greek and Roman history. I consider myself I love history. I'm actually a historian by training. That's what I did my postgraduate studies in, was more history than theology. So I love this stuff. I've read Aristotle. I've got some Plato there to read. I've read some of the classics, some of the Greek classics, the Roman classics. I was a little bit aware of the connection to evolution in coming from Greek thought. I had a little bit of an inkling of that, but I didn't realize just how significant that was. Nor did I realize how significant the Greek contribution to that idea was, even in Darwin's own, was it father or grandfather? And I bring this up because I'm saying this to you guys out there, I consider myself reasonably well read in these areas, but I still learned a lot from this book about this particular topic, which was actually really helpful for me to actually understand something which you guys talk about. And I think you do a really good job of explaining this, that the ancient Greek scientific worldview had a lot of influence in the West for quite some time, but many aspects of that worldview have been shot down and replaced with better science. And I didn't realize the extent to which that had happened. So I was really, really delighted to read about that. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about that for a bit?
Yeah, it's one thing we discovered in our research was a book by a British Darwinist called Edward Clodd. So Clodd was writing around the turn of the right at the end of the 19th century. So he was a few years after Darwin. Darwin had passed away in the 1880s. But what he wrote this book called From Thales to Huxley, The Development of the Evolution Idea. So Thales was an intellectual from around 600 BC in the sort of the Greek area. Huxley, he was referring to Thomas Huxley, as we said before, Darwin's bulldog. So he was sort of the, as Darwin had passed away, Huxley was sort of taking the vanguard of evolutionary thought. So what Claude saw was this lengthy period from 600 BC right through to his present day, which was, he's writing around about 1897. What he saw was a progression of evolutionary thought, but he saw it as being interrupted, in his view, by the lamentable rise of Christianity, which he thought of as like a suppression of scientific thought. So what he pointed out was, going back to the ancients, from Thales through to about 50 BC, there was a Roman intellectual called Lucretius. So from 600 BC through to 50 BC, there's that span of about 500 years where evolutionary thought progresses in the ancient world, deriving from sort of their pagan conception or pagan religious perspective. Then it sort of gets suppressed, and then he sees it as being taken up again by sort of the modern day, the Darwins and Darwin's grandfather Erasmus and so forth. So I guess what we noticed there was back in Darwin's day, it was actually a known, or viewed as evolution was viewed as a sort of a recrudescence of that ancient thought. So Jeff, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Another interesting point is that several of the ancient Greek ideas were sort of foundational to the evolutionary worldview. And we mention a couple of these in our book. So the first, now these views were not necessarily held by everyone. Ancient Greece was not a monolith. There was different schools of thought and different important thinkers. But there was this idea from ancient Greece about the universe being eternal. And so that was really coming back into vogue through the 1800s, this idea that the universe has always existed and that it's self-existent. And obviously that helps with the evolutionary worldview, naturalistic worldview, because it provides an explanation for why the universe exists and also gives these vast time spans you would need for evolution to occur. The other two things, the other one was spontaneous generation, which we've already mentioned, this idea that life just spontaneously forms naturally and frequently, which was still a major view even when Darwin was publishing Origin, as Graham said, overturned by Pasteur just shortly after he published his book. And then the third thing was this idea of evolution, which was that these simple organisms that were spontaneously generated over time could develop into more complicated organisms. Now, they didn't have a view of evolution like the modern one. There was no concept of natural selection, but the elements were there. And it's derived from some of these ancient Greek thinkers.
Yeah, and that's what Darwin was kind of credited with doing, was giving the mechanism which supported the worldview. They just said, like, they wanted the worldview that said, if the universe is eternal, and that disagrees with Genesis. There is no beginning, and we've got enough time for anything. If life can spontaneously generate from matter, then the idea of evolution wouldn't even be very difficult, would it? You don't even really need... I don't even think you would need much descent to come up with an argument. That's why there's guys like Lamarckism, and there's different views of evolution that were being put around. And Darwin's own father or grandfather was one of those who put forward a view. But the idea of natural evolution via natural selection was what was considered Darwin's innovative way of saying, well, the Greeks were right and the Bible was wrong. And that was essentially what was happening. This worldview, these worldviews were being challenged and clashing. What I find fascinating is also how many of the other Greek ideas, so for example, the geocentric idea, the geocentric model that everything revolves around the Earth, there was a lot of observational science which backed that up. I find that fascinating. Like, there was a lot of observational science, but then they started to notice flaws in it. And so they added what they called epicycles. And these epicycles, so you had, instead of having this nice, neat circles, you had these weird little circles everywhere which explain the differences. And it took Galileo, who's famous, Kepler, and then Newton. Those three, the combination of their scientific developments to basically unseat that and bring what we now understand today to be the heliocentric model, which is that the planets revolve around the sun. That's another thing that was knocked down in the same time period. There was massive. So basically, the whole Greek worldview had been incorporated into the academic and intellectual body of Western civilization, but successively over time, both Christian and non-Christian scientists, but predominantly Christian scientists, brought it into question, improved on it, and showed where they were wrong. And this is even true in this area because spontaneous generation was shown to be not possible. Experimentation showed, well, incredibly improbable, a naturalistic person might say, but it's never been demonstrated in an experiment.
Yeah.
So the evidence is strongly against it. So, but the level of explanation which you guys give in this topic, I found really helpful because this idea of worldviews is so important. How we see the world, how we see ourselves. If we are just spontaneously generated goo that exists in a never-ending universe that's just always been here and there is no explanation for it, that leads to a particular view of ourselves. If we are intentionally created beings, created by a God of love that has a specific reason for creating us, and that reason is primarily to participate in fellowship with Him and with each other, that creates to a completely different view of ourselves. And we can see this at work in our world. I really thought it was fascinating. And like I said, and I want to say this to the readers out there, you might consider yourself well-read on this topic. I considered myself well-read on this topic, but I still learnt a lot from this book. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really keen to do this interview and to recommend it, because you will learn a lot from this book. And also, it will challenge you on some of the things that you thought you knew well, which might not be up to date with the best science which is out there, which is another reason why this book is so helpful. All right, let's go into this is interesting, this is fascinating, the historical aspect of the X Club, which you guys mentioned in the book. Do you guys want to explain what the X Club is?
Yeah, yes, well, I guess just the context here is that Darwinism has always, or it's always been accompanied by either a coercive or a covert kind of support mechanism. So if we go back to when Darwin was about to launch his book, or was about to publish, he actually assembled what was called a bodyguard of people. These were sort of the 19th century equivalent of Sir David Attenborough, where they were sort of naturalists. They may not have been at the vanguard of scientific research, but nonetheless they were well known. They were seen as good communicators, highly respected by the public. He assembled a group of these so that when his book was published, they would sort of provide this sort of coercive pressure to people, sort of threatening to cancel them. In other words, if a person didn't accept this evolutionary idea, if a scientist didn't accept it, and there were several that didn't, they'd be painted as sort of like these lonely stragglers that couldn't keep up with the rest of the group intellectually, or that they'd lost the elasticity of mind that they might have had when they were younger, but now they're too old to sort of take on these new concepts. So that Darwin, he used this bodyguard to get his theory launched, but later he had he didn't have it, but there was this a group of people that decided to support Darwinism and to promote it, but they used a very covert means of doing this. So one of the reasons they called themselves the X Club was so that they wouldn't be giving any idea to what their purpose was. So there were several ways in which these people or this group of men managed to influence Victorian society in the direction of Darwinism. So the first was they would meet before the Royal Society had its annual elections for people into leadership positions. The X Club would meet beforehand and work out how they would conduct themselves so that their agenda would be achieved. So as people attended these Royal Society meetings, it would look as if proper democratic procedures were being followed, whereas in fact the X Club was sort of those members were sort of aligning their votes and maybe putting forth suggestions so that in fact their man got forward. So for years on end, ex-club members were at the head of the Royal Society, and they were using their position, in ways to influence society in the direction of Darwinism. A couple of examples I'd give was, firstly, this ex-club or ex-network, as we can call it, was they managed to have Darwin awarded the Copley Medal. So back in the day, the Copley Medal was the highest scientific award available, bearing in mind that the Nobel Prize didn't come online until that 1901, I think it was first awarded. So Darwin was awarded the Copley Medal. And then later, on Darwin's death, they used their connections into the liberal church as well as into Parliament to successfully lobby to have Darwin buried in Westminster Abbey. So basically, from those two examples, we can see the X-Club was promoting Darwin as not only a top scientist, but also just a great Englishman, one of the greatest ever. So, buried in Westminster. So that's something I'd point out. Jeff, did you have any further to add on the X-Club?
Yeah, I think they definitely pushed evolution. What they also wanted to do was just to secularize science. At the time they started operating, there was religious oversight of universities and science, and they wanted to move in a more secular direction. And I think they were highly successful in Britain and ultimately throughout the West. But a lot of people just may not be aware of the X-Club and the influence that they had behind the scenes.
It's the narrative is that science is just the dispassionate or pursuit of knowledge and truth. But the reality is they're human fallen beings. Fallen human beings. What did I just say? Fallen beings. Fallen human beings.
Yeah.
They're fallen human beings just like anybody else. And they use nefarious tactics behind the scenes to get their view more prominence than it really was being received with at the day. There were many scientists at the time, who were bringing this into question. It wasn't like Darwin put this forward and everyone's like, wow, we finally understand how the world works. There was a lot of resistance to it, not just because of faith, although that was part of it, but also from a scientific perspective. I've read about scientists in the late 19th century who were calling into question the ability for the fossil record. I mean, Darwin himself, you guys mentioned this in the book, and we can talk about this soon. Darwin himself saw the fossil record as a major weakness in his theory because it didn't match what he was arguing for. But the idea of this club who got together to collectively work to do, to promote each other and put themselves into these positions, it's such a common theme in history. You see it in so many different ways. And it's just interesting. I had no idea about the X-Club. I had no idea about it. I don't know how many books on evolution and creationism I've read over the years. I'd never heard of the X-Club. And like I said, if you consider yourself well read on this topic, I still highly recommend reading this book because you will learn stuff. And it gives you an insight also into, when people say, well, science is about the pursuit of knowledge, Christianity is about suppressing knowledge just to have faith, right? No. As Christians, we understand we're fallen creatures. We understand we don't get everything right. We understand we have fallen minds. We understand that rationality has limits. We all see as though through a mirror darkly. We understand that. But it's true of the secular scientists as well. They are fallen, and they might work in fallen ways. And they're not just putting something forward because it's the best science. It could be for completely different reasons, which is what the X-Club kind of demonstrates. I found that fascinating. I found that really fascinating. All right, so I've got a few other topics that I want to talk about. We've already mentioned this, and so we'll go into it now. The fossil record. And how are you guys doing for time? How much time you got left to keep going?
Good for now. Yeah, thank you.
All right, cool. All right, so the fossil record. We just mentioned that Darwin himself saw this as a major flaw in his theory. Now, obviously, creationists in the past have been some silly views that have come up, like the idea that God put the bones in the ground to deceive people. I don't even know if anyone really held that seriously, or if that's just a view that's used to attack us. Maybe you guys can answer that question. But there is a big flaw in the fossil record when it comes to the naturalistic perspective. Can you guys explain that for us?
Yeah, so at the time, Darwin was promoting his own version of evolution. There had been other versions of evolution put forward before Darwin, like simpler ideas without a mechanism, like Erasmus Darwin, his grandfather, and there were all competing versions like Lamarckism as well, which is the idea that acquired characteristics are passed on. But Darwin, he was convinced that for evolution to occur, it must have been slow, gradual, essentially a smooth upward incline in complexity was his view. And the problem he faced was if evolution is slow, steady, and constant, you would expect in the fossil record to see an abundance of evidence for these intermediate forms. But in fact, there was a huge struggle to find any intermediate forms at all, and he mentioned this in his book. There was an alternate view at the time where they had this idea that evolution proceeded in big jumps and then nothing would happen for a period of time and then you get another big jump. And the early term for that was saltatory evolution, which just means in jumps. Years later, in the mid-1900s, you had Stephen Jay Gould came up with this terminology, punctuated equilibrium, which more or less just means the same thing. But what you'll find is the evolutionary establishment right up until the 1950s basically held fairly strongly to this idea: evolution is steady and smooth. Even though the fossil evidence was not consistent with that, but certainly by the 1970s, the view of the paleontologists started to gain traction, and the evolutionary community started to accept that Darwin's original conception was not correct.
Yeah, so I think it's important for the people in the audience, or people who'll be listening, to understand that punctuated equilibrium, as you said, that term was coined by Stephen Jay Gould, who is quite an interesting writer, but don't disagree with his worldview, is a move away from Darwin. Because as you said, Darwinism and what became known once it included Mendelian genetics, neo-Darwinism, requires slow, steady, consistent change, which adds up over time to larger change. So the acceptance of punctuated equilibrium as part of the forensic evidence out there shows that there's a massive pool of data which disagrees with the Darwinian worldview completely. In fact, the fossil record does not match up. I know some evolutionists will say, well, we've got a reasonably clear fossil record on the horse or something like that. But we've got to explain all of biodiversity, not just one particular part of it. And when you look at this, you see it goes from very simple forms to very complicated forms with nothing in between. Now, this is important. The reason I'm bringing this up, I want people to understand this. Darwin's worldview has already been scientifically, in some cases, rejected. If you look into the scientific literature, you'll see that while the naturalistic explanation is still broadly held to, Darwin's original thesis, Darwin through evolution through natural selection, was shown not to be powerful enough. You then had to add in the Mendelian genetics, which is where you get the neo-Darwinism. But then you've got guys who come along like Kimura, who bring in stuff which basically are trying to answer these questions and show that no, it's just random chance which brings the changes. Now, if you accept Kimura, you're actually completely rejecting Darwin, because Darwin's saying it's not random chance. It's random chance which is selected by natural selection, so it's only the good things which survive. Whereas Kimura is saying, no. The evidence actually fits better with the fact that it is completely random, which is a completely different philosophical and scientific argument. So the reason I bring this up is you guys kind of mentioned some of this stuff in the book. You get into Kimura and that. It's important for people out there to understand that the idea that Darwin was wrong is not just a creationist perspective. The secular scientists have been discussing this for a long time because they understand the data does not fit. They might hold to in fact, maybe you guys will disagree with this, so push back on me if you think I'm incorrect in this, but I think we're almost getting to the point in modern science where we're kind of in the same place that they were before Darwin, whereas there's some form of evolution, but we're not exactly sure how it works. Do you think that's valid, or do you think we're not quite there?
I would tend to agree with that. Like, I think you were talking about Kimura, who he published his neutral theory of evolution back in 1968. And as you say, that sort of moved things away from, it sort of depreciated the power of natural selection at a molecular level and said, there's a lot of random chance going on. And so I think what's tended to happen as more and more information has come to light, we know change occurs and you can get speciation. But this idea of a holistic theory of upwards evolution, the mechanism from my reading is becoming less clear as time has gone on. And so that's why you're starting to get the early signs of a splintering of the consensus. So you've got the extended evolutionary ideas that some people have brought up. You've also got a group who call themselves the Third Way, and they're looking at additional mechanisms, but nothing. I think the modern synthesis as a explanation at a molecular level is under a lot of strain right now, and there's no replacement in sight. So I think they're running into headwinds, not on change happening or speciation, but on this whole narrative of this is an adequate explanation to explain all the diversity of life. I think that's where evolution is running into increasing headwinds.
Yeah, I want people to really understand what we're talking about here. We're talking about the fact that if you question Darwin, you now are actually in line with the most recent science. And so Darwin is no longer the bulwark of fact that he was once held. I mean, how many times have we seen a movie, or you read a book, or watch? I love science fiction, right? And it's just a fact. It's just a fact. Like one of my favorite episodes of Stargate. They're on this. You ever seen that show, Stargate SG-1? It's an old science fiction show from the 90s.
Not me.
There's this episode of Stargate. We're on this planet, and they're investigating the archaeological, the paleontological record of this alien species. And they're in this field, and it's like, here is like an alien from one particular epoch, and there's one here, and there's another one here, and they're like tracing the epoch, and it's like these three digs right next to each other, kind of presenting this false world view that that's how easy it is to discover the scientific evidence for evolution by natural selection. That's common in our culture, but it's not necessarily the truth of the science. And like you just said, I find this fascinating. They're getting to the point where they now don't have a mechanism to explain how it worked. But a lot of people are not aware of that at the popular level. A lot of people just assume that evolution is fact, and that natural selection is the method. And you'll hear this mentioned quite a bit, but it is not the case, and it's starting to be recognized more and more by even secular scientists who are starting to say, we don't know how to explain this.
Yeah, I think there's an increasing diversity of opinion as to the emphasis that's placed on natural selection and just trying to understand the mechanism. And I think also there's been a lot of good work done looking at the plausibility of information increase via evolutionary mechanisms, and the intelligent design community's done some excellent work in that domain and published some excellent texts. But even we found even a famous British scientist, can you think of his name?
Hoyle.
Yeah, Sir Fred Hoyle. He was having these arguments and publishing books about it back in the 80s, the last couple of decades before the turn of the century, questioning the evolutionary mechanisms.
Yeah, he was quite prominent, Hoyle. Sir Fred Hoyle, he's quite famous in scientific circles.
Yeah.
And he managed to question it and not get his credibility. A lot of scientists, when they come out and challenge evolution, their careers are destroyed. But he managed to keep both his prominence and question the theory. And he was explaining, was he a physicist?
Cosmologist.
He was a cosmologist, and he made some, some notable contributions. He was an astounding mathematician, and I think he was sufficiently of a maverick to be able to be outspoken about what he thought was going on. He's a very courageous man. I think he did suffer reputational damage because of some of the positions he took. Some argue he didn't get the Nobel Prize because of...
okay, so he did face some.
Potentially, yes. I mean, we don't know for sure, but that's been suggested. Yeah.
Something we know about prizes is they're more often for being part of the club rather than necessarily merit. Sometimes they can be about merit, but generally it's because you fit a particular popularity of some particular interest group.
Yeah.
So that's not totally surprising. You were going to say something?
Yeah, just back to your point before. I think you made an important point where the science would realize, the science community would realize that the Darwin's mechanism, is sort of declining in plausibility, but the average person, the lay person, doesn't realize that. And what we found when we were writing this book was that this curious timing. We had just around the time that Kimura, the Japanese evolutionist who published neutral theory, just around the time that he was publishing his theory, there was also a court case in the US, which was of Epperson versus Arkansas. That was also around 1968. And that, as a result of that court case, the United States Supreme Court sort of allowed the teaching of evolution, evolution of man by, man coming through evolutionary descent, to be taught across all schools in the United States, and it probably filtered through to the West, But so what we have was just the point where the evolutionary, from a scientific point of view, was beginning to weaken. You got textbooks into basically every school in the West. And we suspect that what's happened is that the average layperson going through the compulsory education system gets a sort of a nuanced view of evolution, sort of almost stuck in the 1960s before a lot of these serious contentious issues were raised. So I think that's why a lot of people may not be aware that the Darwinism is as weak as it is, just because of this timing issue with textbooks.
Yeah, it's so true, that timing thing. I was actually thinking the timing of this book, again, Origins, which is written by the two Messer brothers here, is phenomenal, because right at the time where scientists are becoming the less certain about the mechanisms, which are the foundation of part of their origin story, you've written a collection of the best scientific arguments to defend the Christian worldview. But also, on what you're just talking about there, you're absolutely right. I had no idea who Kimura was until late last year, because I started reading your book, and I started reading another book called Probability Zero at the same time, which is Probability Zero, the Mathematical Impossibility of the Theory of Evolution by Natural Selection by Vox Day. And Kimura was a significant part of that book and a second book that he's written. And reason I bring that up in the context of your book is, while I was reading your book, you actually helped me to understand the significance of Kimura, which helped me to actually understand that other book even better. So I was reading this other book, which is giving a very detailed argument about how the mathematics of evolution does not work out. And that's been known for some time. There were scientists who pointed this out in the late 19th century, but there's also mathematicians who pointed it out in the 1960s. It is now coming to the forefront again because we have the genetic evidence. But in reading your book, I was like, now I guess I could have spent a whole morning on like a Wikipedia rabbit hole where look up Kimura and you ever done that? You go on Wikipedia and then you just find yourself having read 5 articles in an hour. Where did my morning go, sort of thing? I could have done that, I guess, to find out. But I was reading your book, and just after I'd read some of the stuff in that about the Kimura thing, I'm like, well, this is interesting, but I didn't fully understand it. I wanted to find out more. And your book actually explained that, which I found really helpful. And what you just said is so true. Guys, really need to understand this. The science which kids are being taught in school, even to a large degree in university, is stuck in the past. And it's probably only maybe at the graduate or postgraduate level where they're learning the most advanced stuff. And the reason is because they'll specialize in something, and then anyone who's studied at a postgraduate level understands this. You know, you learn the basics in the graduate level, and you learn some good stuff, and you learn a lot of nonsense as well.
Yeah.
And then you get into the postgraduate level where you learn to critique it, and you learn to add to the academic record. And so this is true in basically every field to some degree or another. Even in theology, it's true in other sciences as well, and also in the humanities. But this is really significant. Kimura's argument is basically that the neutral mutations are much more than the positive and negative, and they are behind the change. Whereas in the standard idea, negative mutations are the majority, positive ones are the minority, and neutral ones don't really have much effect. And selection works on getting rid of the negative ones by advancing the positive ones, which are much rarer, and that's why evolution is so slow. So if you accept Kimura, and a lot of evolutionists today at the academic level accept that Kimura gave another mechanism, that's again a rejection of Darwin. So it's important to understand you are no longer, no one who is in the know can accuse you of being unscientific for rejecting Darwin now, because a large part of the evolutionary worldview now rejects him because the science doesn't fit up with his argument. Which brings us back to your book again, because it shows the science actually fits with the Christian worldview in so many different ways. We could talk about that for a long time, that particular area, but we might get into a bit of esoteric specifics, which some people might not be able to follow unless you've read the book, and then you'll be able to understand it quite simply. We've been going for quite a while now, so is there anything that you guys what do you think is the major selling point of your book? What is something that you would like people listening to this interview to take away as a reason that they should read this?
Yeah, so as I said, I think I said earlier, we wrote this book as like a sort of a one-stop shop where, in a single volume you can get a complete overview of the entire origins debate. So I think it would be suitable for anyone that wants to get across the debate. And we haven't just, we're not just regurgitating the kinds of points that the creationist movement might have come up with over the years. We also put in a lot of our own analysis here. So we're hearing from veteran creationists that they're learning a lot reading the book, which is pleasing. I just think this book will give you an overview. And then, if you want to go further from there, there's other more specialized books that you could read. But this would be an excellent entry point into the evolution debate. So it'd be useful for a range of people, including pastors, if they wanted a resource that they could point. If you had an interested church member that was asking you about, how can I learn more? This would be a good book to refer them to. But I think for the most part, people that would like to learn more about the evolution debate, I think a great entry point. Jeff, did you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, so before we wrote the book, we were looking around for books that would do what this book does. We wanted to get across the material in an up-to-date fashion, and we really struggled to find one that we felt was up-to-date. And also, a lot of the books will address the science and the theology, but we wanted to also focus on the history and the philosophy, just to cover the whole thing off.
Yeah, and I concur with you guys on that. This book is excellent for summarizing the main points in every aspect of this topic. And so for that reason, I highly recommend you read Origin. I highly recommend it. I do think it would be a vital resource for pastors. If you're a pastor out there and you're ill-equipped, or you think you're ill-equipped to handle these issues or approach them in a good way, this book will give you a good grasp on the issues. If you're a lay Christian out there who loves to do evangelism or wants to discuss this with your friends, your family, this book is going to equip you very well. If you're in any way interested in the origin debate, even if you're not a Christian, look, if you're not a Christian out there and you're watching this, I would recommend that you read this book, because you've got to understand that as Christians, we believe in truth. We do not believe in wanting to pursue nonsense. Now, you might think some of our views are nonsense, right? And I will not disagree that some Christians have presented some nonsense in history, right? We would never deny that. But at the heart of Christianity is the pursuit of truth. That's what we want. That's what we want, guys, isn't it?
Yes.
And so we're not trying to suppress the reality of this world, but handle the evidence the best we can in the most responsible manner. And look, I've published 2 books. I've written a couple more. Hopefully more are coming. But I know what it takes to write a detailed research and significant book. And my first book that I wrote was a lot like that. In fact, it started as a PhD thesis. I decided not to do the PhD and decided to turn it into a book instead, and I co-wrote it with another Baptist pastor. So when I say that this is well researched, I'm not just saying that. I actually can see the amount of work that went into this. And in this day and age, we're busy. We've got a lot of things on our schedule. We don't all have the ability to dedicate the same amount of research and time as the 2 Messer brothers have done here. So it's something we should be really thankful for, that there are people out there like them who will put this in a book form for us. You guys can buy this book. You can get it on Amazon. You can buy it on Kindle. You can buy the physical version. And it will help you understand just how credible the Christian worldview is. So do you guys have anything you'd like to say before we finish up?
For me, I just hope this book does bring a lot of benefits to people. I hope it helps people to understand the Christian viewpoint and why Genesis 1-11 makes sense. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I hope this book finds its way into the hands of people who perhaps are struggling with their faith because they've been told that science and Christianity don't match up. And I'm hoping, people who struggle with faith or even are at risk of falling away can have a look at the evidence and see that there's a lot more to the Christian position than the secular world would tell us.
Awesome. And you guys have a website? You want to just look at the camera and tell people the website they can go to?
Yep, www.rechristianize.com.
www.rechristianize.com. Check out the website, check out the book. Remember, you can check out my writings on younggospelminister.blogspot.com, Rev Matt's writings on Substack. You can, please, if you've enjoyed this content today, like, comment, and subscribe, and share this video with someone else. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.